Welcome back to another episode of Words with Friends. We are so happy that you're here with us. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to be doing a whole new series over the Torah, also known as the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so we are starting with Genesis. And here's my question. Why is the beginning of a story so important?
Ooh, the beginning of the story, it's what draws you in.
Right.
It's what makes you lean forward and say, I want to know more about that.
Yeah.
It was a dark and stormy night.
Okay, see, that was my next question. Do you have any openings or story beginnings?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Yes, memorized.
A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Great. Luke, you don't have any story?
I don't read books.
Okay, another one I have is Call Me Ishmael, and I've never read that book, but it makes me think of your son because he's read the junior version of it.
That's true.
I'm trying to think of any other ones. I don't think I know any other ones. The Best of Times, Worst of Times, I thought of that one too. And then again, so the beginning of the Bible obviously starts with this verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. And in that one verse is a lot to unpack. That's a huge opening to a story, and it makes you want to learn more. It makes you want to learn about this creation, about the heavens and the earth, and then everything else he creates after that. So, Genesis is a very dense book. It has a lot that goes on. And so today we're only focusing on chapters 1 through 11. And this video is going to talk about some of the things that happen in the video and how it sets up the foundation for the redemption story for the rest of Genesis. So enjoy this video and be thinking about that, and we'll see you after that.
The first book in the Bible is a book you've probably heard of. It's called Genesis.
Genesis comes from a Hebrew word. It's pronounced reshit, and it just means beginning.
Now, there's a lot of stories from the book of Genesis, and it's easy just to pull out a specific story and try to tell you what it might mean. But we think the best way to understand this book is to look at the book as a whole and show you how the whole thing is designed.
The book is designed to fall into 2 main parts. You have chapters 1 through 11, which is telling the story of God and the whole world. And then you have the second part, which is about God and Abraham's family, as chapters 12 through 50. And how the 2 of those parts relate, that's where you find the message of the book.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning. The first part of Genesis begins with a creation story where God creates everything.
And how exactly that happens, of course, that's where all the debates come. But he takes a dark, watery chaos and he turns it into a beautiful garden where humans can flourish.
That sounds nice.
It does sound nice. In fact, 7 different times God says of all that he's made that it's good.
And this is where we meet the first human characters in the Bible, Adam and Eve.
They're both individual characters, but they're also representative. Adam is the Hebrew word for humanity, and Eve is the Hebrew word for life. And God creates them in his image. In other words, humanity reflects, or is meant to reflect, the creativity, the goodness, and character of the Creator out into the world that he's made. And they're supposed to reproduce and make cultures and neighborhoods and art and gardens and everything else. But he gives them a moral
choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about.
And he tells them, don't eat of the fruit of this tree or you will die. What's that all about?
So up till now, God has been the one defining and providing what is good. And so God is the one with the knowledge of good and evil. But now this tree represents a choice. Will the humans trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize the opportunity and define good and evil for themselves?
And Adam and Eve eat the fruit.
This is the core biblical explanation for that concept of sin, that desire to call the shots myself. It's the inward turn of the human heart to do what's good for me and my tribe, even if it's at the expense of you and your tribe.
And the problem is humans are horrible at defining good and evil without God. And so now that humanity's made this choice, things get
really bad. So Genesis 3 through 11 is like tracing this downward spiral of all humanity. So Adam and Eve, they can't trust each other anymore. And so there's a little story about how they were naked and felt fine about it beforehand, but now they feel shameful because all of a sudden Adam's definition of good and evil might be different than Eve's, and so they hide from each other.
Then there's another story of temptation. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and he gives in and kills him.
There's a story right after Cain about a guy named Lamech, and all we know about Lamech is that he accumulates wives like property, and he sings songs about how he's a more violent, vengeful person than Cain ever was, and he's proud of it.
Things get so bad with the human race that we see God decide to just wipe us out.
Yeah, we typically think of the flood story is about God being angry, but it actually begins with God's sadness and grief about the state of his world. And so out of his passion to preserve the goodness of his world, he washes it clean with the flood.
But there's a glimmer of hope. He chooses Noah and his whole family, and he saves them on this boat.
Yeah, don't forget about the animals.
Right, and the animals. So Noah and his family are going to reboot all of humanity. I mean, he must be a pretty great guy.
But this is the story most people don't know because it's kind of weird, is that Noah gets off the boat and he plants a vineyard and he gets totally plastered. And then something sketchy happens in his tent with his son. It's a tragic story.
So from here, humanity grows again, but things are as bad as before. And the last story is the famous story of the Tower of Babel.
And in this story, you have all of the nations uniting together to use this new technology they have, the brick. And they want to make a name for themselves and build this big city with a huge tower that will reach up to the gods. But God knows that this city will be a nightmare. And so in his mercy, he scatters them. And all of these stories, they're underlining the same basic idea. When humans seize autonomy from God, when they define good and evil for themselves, it results in a world of tragedy and death.
And this leaves you wondering, is there any hope for humanity?
Yes, yeah, there is. It's the very next story that answers that question. It's the beginning of God's mission to rescue and restore his world.
Okay, we hope you enjoyed that video. Now, what are your guys' initial thoughts after watching that?
I think maybe it was the animation, but it just helped me think of it like an epic story, like The Hobbit or Star Wars or any of those stories that you know are going to have the Odyssey, a lot of battles. And it is, when I say epic, I mean that in both ways. Like, this is epic in that it's long, but then it's epic like, oh, this is really cool. Just lots of swords and stuff for guys.
Drama.
Yeah.
It paints that picture of the downward spiral.
Yes.
The first 11 chapters are just chaos going downward, which leads to
Well,
what we're
really,
gonna
the
talk
first
about
chapter
next.
is fine.
Right.
2 through 11.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also like to know that there's a story that knits it all the way to, like, from the beginning to end, all the way through. There's nothing worse than starting a series or starting an anthology or starting a trilogy and then finding out, oh, they kind of just made this stuff up at the end.
Right, that there's a plan.
Yes, and I don't know. So often we take books out of context, or we take, well, there's this story, or, I don't know what they'll do with Leviticus, but like it all is tied together with a common thread, and I know that's where they're headed with this.
So, like we said before, Genesis is the beginning. It is the beginning of literally everything. Our entire world, the heavens, the earth, all of it. And so it begins with that story, with God creating and saying after every creation, this is good, this is good, this is good. And then we get to the creation of man. And this is this verse. Luke, would you read it?
Yeah. It says Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them.
Okay, so we talk about this a lot in church, but I want to ask the question, what does it mean for humanity to be created in the image of God?
Ooh, the Latin is the imago Dei, that we somehow look like God, that there's something about us that is reflective of Him. In some ways, I think you can take that too far, and we and I think they highlight that that's the problem in the story of Genesis, that people keep trying to grab onto power. But what's really bad in our culture is the low, the way we regard mankind, humankind, as something very low and debased. So to hear that it's the image of God, to me, that sounds like it's something precious. That's something divine.
Right. Yeah. It makes me think of made with purpose. We were made differently for a reason. We talked about this in my class last Wednesday, but we're the only thing that was given a soul. When it talks about breathe in the living breath, like we were given that soul to be made in the image, in His likeness, to have a relationship with Him.
I loved that after it spoke about being created in the image of God, it talked about how we were to reflect all of those things, creativity, and bring culture and all of that to this world.
Right.
So we were like a reflection of Him onto this world that He created. I loved that. I think that's a very simplistic and yet graceful way to put it. So what kind of responsibility does that put on us to be made in the image of God?
Well, I would say that that's everyone, that we want to say, well, those people who act right, or those people who love God. But no, the responsibility then is for me to treat everyone as if they were image bearers of God.
Right.
And what I want to do is say, well, I'll treat God followers or people that love God in the way like they were. No, it means everybody bears His image, and that's difficult because some people are difficult to love.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. I think that the responsibility is to treat everyone the same as a created creation. And so, just and like you said, that's difficult to remember all the time.
Agreed. Now, so God created man, created woman, and then they live in this beautiful garden where everything is provided for them, and they don't have any sense of right or wrong. That is God's. And so God creates this tree, puts this tree in the garden, and says, you can eat any fruit in the garden but this tree, because if you eat from this tree, you will surely die. You will know good and evil, and it will cause you harm. But that temptation is too much for man and woman. So why do you suppose that God created this choice for humanity by planting this tree in this garden with them?
Oh, I don't know that I can know the mind of God there.
Right.
But I feel like I parallel everything with my own parenting. And so I think I want my kids to learn to make good choices early, and we do that by giving them small choices, and then those choices grow. But if we don't know how to make good choices, then it's chaos.
Right.
And so without that ability to choose, they become this kind of mindless automatons. But I think it's God's way of parenting us to say this, because I think the Adam and Eve story is the story of all mankind. And I think everybody faces the same question. And I think we all fail in it in the same way, that we all grasp. I love that one picture of it. It looked like everybody was grasping for something, and we're all doing that. We're all grasping for power.
Right. Yeah. I think it's sets up the entire story of why God created us to have a relationship with Him. He didn't just create us to be mindless slaves to whatever His will was. He gives us the choice to have that relationship with Him. And I think that starts with giving us choices in everything else.
So obviously Adam and Eve did not follow God's instructions. They did eat the fruit, which began that downward spiral that we talked about. So what are the lasting repercussions of Adam and Eve's decision?
There's a lot there, because it's not just, it is separation from God. That's the consequence. And then there's hard work and labor, and then there's pain in childbirth and all those kind of consequences. But there's also guilt and shame. Like very quickly, guilt and shame enter into the equation. And that might be our most difficult adversary to overcome. Not temptation as much as what do we do when we've failed. Because I think the story of Adam and Eve is that we're all fallen, and then the question becomes, we stopped recording. There it is. Sorry. The question then becomes, what do we do with the guilt and shame? How do we then approach God after we've been cast out?
Yeah. I think we received the knowledge of good and evil, and we've spent the rest of eternity trying to define what that is. Nobody can agree on what is good. Nobody can agree. Well, no, that this is bad.
Right.
This is where the evil line starts. And so I think that as humans, as we were then given the responsibility, well, okay, that separation, you're on your own, figure it out amongst yourselves, was never going to be a system that worked, which is why we were created to walk with God, because he knew that when it came to us trying to figure it out for ourselves, that it was never going to work.
Just let me silence this phone.
That's a good idea.
Okay, we're good.
Okay, so after this decision, this cycle is created. The cycle of human sin, consequences, and then God's grace. And that is really the beginning of the downfall. So every story after that has that cycle. And this next story we come to that the video talks about is the story of the flood. And I hadn't ever really thought about this, but did the video make you think differently about God's decision to flood the earth?
This is an interesting question. In college, I was in an earth science class, and we went over the discussion of, was this the first time that God had wiped the earth? And think about that in the sense of, were Adam and Eve the first attempt, the first creation, or were there separate times
really
where
trippy.
Yeah,
That's
was
super.
it
We don't
like
have time for that.
Yeah, and so it went into this huge thing. So I've always thought about the flood. So and then you get in, was it a regional flood? Was it a world flood?
Oh,
the
okay.
whole 9 yards with that.
We got 20 minutes.
Right. But yeah, no, I think it's definitely something it's hard to comprehend, because you wouldn't want to think that God would just give up on so many people, but yet he was doing it for a reason, to say, I have a purpose. We've strayed too far from it, and so now let's try to bring it back.
It goes back to the discussion of God's wrath that we talked about a few weeks ago, that when God disciplines or when God wipes things out, it's for our benefit. Left unchecked, every inclination of every human heart was only evil all the time. Now multiply that by 2,000 years, and I don't know where we would be right now. We probably would have imploded. And the sadness of it, I think, is what's great. It says the Lord regretted. He's despondent over it. It's not he got angry like a child and turned over all of his toys.
Speaking of that scripture,
Yeah.
I have that. That's Genesis 6, 5 through 8, if you would read that for us.
Yeah, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. There's the sadness.
Yep.
So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
That's what stuck out to me, because I had always thought that God was angry. I had thought that he was sad, but just, I can't imagine creating this beautiful thing and then watching it destroy itself and having to make that decision to destroy it.
Right.
And thank goodness he did find favor in Noah and his family, because I can't imagine starting from scratch.
It's the same thing he asked Abram to do.
Yes, that's exactly what I thought.
Which is a terrible story.
Yes.
Which
is probably going to be in the next
Yeah,
video.
it will be the next one. Yeah.
So we come to the final piece of this video, which is the Tower of Babylon.
Babel.
Yes. Not Babylon. Tower of Babel. I wrote in my notes Tower of Babylon. You're welcome for that. What is the significance of the story of the Tower of Babel?
Again, it's that, thinking too highly of ourselves.
Yes.
Of wanting to be in the driver's seat, that, hey, if we can do this and we can all work together, then we're going to ascend into the heavens and we're going to be greater than God. That was the temptation, by the way, in the garden. The devil tells Eve, no. He knows that if you eat this, then you'll be like him. And that's the temptation, is for us to sit on the throne, is for us to be in God's place. And so it's such an interesting story, because I just remember this as a Sunday school lesson, and then thinking that how confused they must have been when they started speaking and couldn't understand
It's like having a toddler.
Yeah. Ah.
Yeah. So the overall theme of Genesis 1 through 11 is exactly what he was just saying. When you seek autonomy from God, the result is tragedy. You cannot want to be in a relationship with God and also be God. That is only going to result in sadness for you and for the world around you. But at the end of that video, it said hope is coming. And the very next story is when God begins his mission to truly rescue his creation. So any final thoughts?
I'll say that for somebody who is reading Genesis, maybe for the first time, it's easy to get caught up in the details so much because people want to know, well, was it a literal 7 days?
Where are the dinosaurs?
Yeah, where is this everything? But I think it's important to what we've said the entire time. The big story, the big picture.
Yes.
This is just the beginning of something that will be much, much bigger.
Well, and it's the danger of Scripture. Somebody once described it as missing the rainbow for counting the raindrops. Like you get so focused on the tiny details that you miss the overall picture. And the overall picture, jumping way ahead all the way to Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of us? That we would do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Like that, I don't know. I love to see how they're drawing all of that one theme all the way through.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back next week with another episode of Words with Friends.
Yay!